Welcome back to Mighty Ride Junkies as we continue to take a look at the history of Knott's Scary Farm, starting where we left off the 1980s. As I mentioned before in part 1 of this series, Knott's Scary Farm had a solid formula by 1975 and wouldn't really change it until the end of this decade. With that being said, I highly recommend you watch part 1 first to better understand some of the things that I'm going to mention in this video. 1980 had two standalone mazes. First, the Chilling Maze, which was a fraction of what it once was back when it was known as the 10 Chilling Chambers. And Dr. Alucard's Chamber of Horrors was another maze that had introduced itself this year, which, for the kids at home, spell Alucard backwards and you'll see what this maze was about. 1981 was a rough year for Knott's Scary Farm. Walter Knott was facing serious health issues that made the Knott family more involved with him than the park in general. A new CEO had taken over and began mapping out years to come rather than focusing on 1981, and the event had some setbacks. Lackluster mazes, and copy and paste shows from the previous year. The only real difference was Knott's Berry Tales. Instead of getting that light settled down, eerie music playing formula, there were now more scary decorations within the ride to aid the scare actors. It went under the banner Circus Horrors. There is a huge historical setback for this event when it comes to retaining the memories of the 1980 Scary Farm. In fact, during the park's 40th anniversary, a museum was put into the park celebrating and highlighting the events for Knott's Scary Farm. Anything that had to do with the mazes or shows had to be reestablished by people who had actually been there during the event, which unfortunately goes by interpretation rather than history. And because everyone interprets things differently, there is a lot of conflicting information from the 1980s Halloween events. Needless to say, I took the most common ground stuff, and that's what we're going to cover. 1982 brought the terrifying trail of Jack the Ripper. The story of the maze had you being the lead detective following the streets of Whitechapel and focusing on all the grisly scenes that Jack the Ripper had left behind. But don't get too focused on the dead, for Jack was lurking in the shadows. The second maze was the Mysterious Corridors. It is exactly like it sounds, mysterious. Knott's Berry Farm really didn't start keeping solid a record for this event until 1989. Because of this, some of the information has been lost in time. The Mysterious Corridor is an example of this. The outline of the maze that was available shows it was an actual maze where parkgoers would have to learn how to get in and get out. Way too long, and the monsters might find you. This sounds like another version of a recent maze called Mirrors, except the outline for it makes me think it had multiple pathways. However, 1982's main focus was Elvira coming to host Knott's Scary Farm. 1983 had two firsts that took place. First, the introduction of sliders. Now, before anyone goes on and says, I remember seeing this before 1983, let me clarify. In 1976, scare actors would wear skateboard or volleyball knee pads and essentially run and belly flop on the ground. Sliding on the knee pads about 3 or 4 feet, the act in itself did cause harm to some scare actors. But in 1983, a scare actor named Todd Stubbler began using knee pads paired with boots, gloves outfitted with flux conduits and washers. Stubbler began sliding across the streets of Ghost Town to scare would-be guests. Sliders changed a lot of things for Halloween parks. Through the years, Knott's Berry Farm had to develop a slider test for slider monsters due to the high demand of the body and to make sure they had enough control to prevent injury from guests and themselves. You can now find sliders pretty much at any mainstream Halloween park, but the birthplace will forever be Knott's Scary Farm. The second thing is a bit more on the tragic scale. On Halloween night, 18-year-old Donald Day was riding the parachute sky jump with one of his friends. For unknown reasons, Day climbed over the safety railing and fell to the ground headfirst 100 feet below. He suffered a fractured skull, which ultimately caused him to expire. 1984 saw Caverns of Doom, a maze where guests would walk through the caverns while trying to avoid the creatures that was lurking among them. Think The Descent. House of the Red Death was a maze inspired by the story by Edgar Allan Poe. Shakers were introduced in the park this year as a way to distract and confuse the unsuspecting guests. But from 1984 to 1986, the event didn't change that much. It pretty much kept the same layout, only adding a couple upgrades here and there, but nothing new, unless you want to count them using Camp Snoopy's train as part of the Scary Farm event. In 1987, however, well, it started the domino effect that made Knott's Scary Farm the powerhouse that it is today. When 1987 hit, Knott's Scary Farm was really the only event targeted towards an older crowd to get their scare on. The 80s were a huge time for horror films as well. Nightmare on Elm Street, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Halloween, and Friday the 13th were still coming out with sequels, and no one really saw anything close to Knott's Scary Farm at the time. Universal Studios Hollywood had tried the previous year at a Halloween event and failed. Yet, Scary Farm did everything it could to get more people to come, and man, did not sell it. They continued their rethemed rides and doubled the mazes in the park, bringing the total to 4. Then there was the Kingdom of Dinosaurs, which had opened that same year, and while the ride hadn't been rethemed yet, it was still advertised with the Scary Farm event due to it being so new. 1988 kept the maze total the same, but officially gave the ride Kingdom of the Dinosaurs its first rethemed title, The Dark, which is exactly as it sounds. All the lights are turned off, eerie music is playing, and there's scare actors about while you're moving on this slow ride. It also began changing the formula for the show The Hanging. A random gypsy was hung this year as opposed to the witch, but now there were little short jokes placed into the show for comedic relief. Which brings us to 1989. From here on out, The Hanging was under new management, Freddy Krueger and Beetlejuice. The two would run the show together until 1991, when Freddy would take over full-time by himself, but more on that in a different video. The year was getting quite a lineup for its 17th season. Bates Motel, a maze that pushed the envelope for copyright infringement, as the claim was this maze had nothing to do with Psycho, was back from the previous year. But a new maze called Witch Maze debuted for its solo season. Witch Maze was an actual real maze, and to say it failed would not be justified. This maze was huge, and hitting dead ends constantly, attempting to go back and forth the way you came, bumping into newcomers, walking in the opposite direction, fire codes only allowing a certain amount of people in the actual maze at once, making the line to this maze atrocious. If this had been a pay extra maze, it might have been successful, but we will never know. From here on out, a pattern was created for Scary Farm with rotating mazes, and seeing what would stay and what would change in between each season. It took about 4 years for them to get it right, but eventually we would have the pattern we see today. But more on that, and everything else, in the next video. Stay tuned.